Okay, so I've got this story I wanted to tell people. I never thought a Tinder match would turn my life upside down, but that's exactly what happened last summer. It all started when I swiped right on James, a seemingly normal guy with a charming smile and a love for the outdoors. His profile looked harmless enough, pictures of him hiking, playing with a dog, and hanging out with friends. We matched and started chatting, hitting it off right away with our shared interests in travel and photography. After a few days of messaging, James suggested we meet for coffee. I was excited but nervous, as this was my first Tinder date. We agreed to meet at a popular cafe downtown on a Saturday afternoon. I arrived early, found a table, then waited anxiously, sipping my latte and checking my phone every few seconds. When James walked in, my stomach dropped. He looked like his photos, but something about him felt off. His eyes darted around the cafe before landing on me, and his smile seemed forced. As he sat down, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Throughout our date, James asked really specific questions about my life. He wanted to know where I worked, which gym I went to, and even which grocery store I preferred. I tried to keep my answers vague, but he kept pressing for details. His intensity made me uncomfortable, and I found myself checking the time, hoping the date would end soon. After what felt like hours but was only 30 minutes, I made up an excuse about meeting friends and hurried out of the cafe. James tried to hug me goodbye, holding on way too long. I left feeling relieved it was over, but also unsettled by his behavior. That night, I blocked James on Tinder and thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I spotted a black Honda Civic parked across from my apartment. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I noticed James sitting in the driver's seat, staring at my building. My heart raced as I quickly went inside, locking the door behind me. Over the next few weeks, James' car seemed to appear everywhere I went. I'd see it outside my workplace, at the shopping center, and even following me to friends' houses. I started taking different routes home and changing out my schedule, but somehow he always found me. One morning, while getting coffee before work, James suddenly appeared beside me in line. He acted surprised to see me, but his eyes told a different story. When I tried to leave, he grabbed my wrist hard, insisting we needed to talk. The barista noticed and threatened to call security, which made James let go and storm out. Shaken, I filed a police report that day. The officer took down my statement but said they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence of stalking. I felt helpless and scared, not knowing what James might do next. The situation escalated one night when I woke up to scratching sounds at my bedroom window. Through the curtains, I saw James' face pressed against the glass. I screamed and called 911, but he disappeared before they arrived. The police finally took my case seriously and increased patrols in my area, but I was too terrified to stay in my apartment. I moved in with my older brother temporarily, hoping to feel safer. He's a construction worker with an intimidating build, which gave me some comfort. But somehow, James found my new address. He started leaving notes on my brother's truck and sending threatening messages from different phone numbers. Each time I blocked one, he used another. My brother was furious when he saw how scared I was. One night, after a particularly frightening message from James, my brother decided he had enough. He went out looking for James, knowing he frequented a local bar from the social media stalking I'd shown him. I stayed home, sick with worry about what might happen. 2 hours later, my brother returned with bruised knuckles and a split lip. He wouldn't give me details, just said he'd taken care of it, and that James wouldn't be bothering me anymore. Later, I heard through mutual friends that James had ended up with a broken nose and some cracked ribs. True to my brother's word, the stalking stopped immediately after that night. James vanished from my life as suddenly as he'd entered it. I stayed at my brother's place for another month, slowly regaining my sense of security. When I finally moved back to my apartment, I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts, and switched gyms as a precaution. For weeks, I struggled to sleep through the night, often waking up in a panic thinking I heard noises outside. I'd check and double check my locks, and I started carrying pepper spray everywhere I went. My friends and family were supportive, but they couldn't fully understand the constant fear I lived with. As time passed, the panic attacks became less frequent, and I started to feel more like myself again. I cautiously resumed some of my old routines, always staying alert for any sign of James. My brother checked in on me regularly, and knowing he was looking out for me helped ease my fears. 6 months have gone by now since that night my brother confronted James. I haven't seen or heard from him since, and I hope I never will. Sometimes I still catch myself scanning for his car or looking over my shoulder, but those moments are becoming rarer. I started dating again, though I'm much more cautious now. I always meet in public places, tell friends where I'm going, and trust my instincts if something feels off. The whole experience taught me that you never really know who's behind a dating profile, and a simple match can sometimes lead to unexpected dangers. While I'm glad the ordeal is over, I can't help but wonder if James is out there doing the same thing to someone else. I hope not, but I try not to dwell on it too much. For now, I'm focusing on moving forward and reclaiming my life one day at a time. I never thought my Friday night Tinder date would end with me chasing a thief down the street, but that's exactly what happened last week. It all started when I matched with Rajesh, a seemingly nice guy with a charming smile and a decent job as a software engineer. After chatting for a few days, we decided to meet up for coffee at a local cafe. As I walked into the cozy coffee shop, I spotted Rajesh sitting at a corner table. He looked just like his profile pictures, tall, dark-haired, and dressed in a casual button-down shirt and jeans. I waved and made my way over, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. We ordered our drinks and settled in for some small talk. At first, everything seemed normal. We chatted about our jobs, hobbies, and favorite local spots. Rajesh told me about his work in artificial intelligence and his weekend hiking trips. I shared stories about my marketing job and my love for trying new restaurants. About 20 minutes into our date, I started to notice something off about Rajesh's behavior. He kept glancing around the cafe nervously, his eyes darting to the exit and then back to me. His responses to my questions became shorter and more distracted. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just socially awkward or having second thoughts about our date. Suddenly, Rajesh stood up and mumbled something about needing to use the restroom. As he walked past my chair, I felt a sharp tug on my purse strap. Before I could even process what was happening, Rajesh had snatched my bag and was sprinting towards the door. For a split second, I sat there in shock, unable to believe what had just occurred. Then adrenaline kicked in, and I leaped to my feet, knocking over my chair in the process. I shouted for someone to stop him, but the other customers just stared in confusion as I raced after Rajesh. I burst out of the cafe onto the busy street, frantically scanning the crowd for any sign of him. I spotted him about half a block away, weaving through pedestrians with my purse clutched tightly under his arm. Without thinking, I took off after him, my heart pounding in my chest. As I ran, I yelled for help, trying to get the attention of passersby or maybe even a police officer. But most people just stepped aside, looking bewildered or annoyed. I could feel my lungs burning as I pushed myself to run faster, desperate not to lose sight of Rajesh. We raced down 2 blocks, with Rajesh constantly looking over his shoulder to see if I was still behind him. I was gaining ground, fueled by a mixture of anger and determination. Just as I thought I might actually catch up to him, Rajesh suddenly veered into a narrow alley between 2 buildings. I skidded around the corner after him, only to find the alley was a dead end. Rajesh was trapped, panting heavily and looking around frantically for an escape route. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both breathing hard from the chase. "Give me back my purse," I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. Rajesh's eyes darted between me and the alley entrance, clearly weighing his options. I took a step closer, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Just then, I heard shouting from the street. 2 men who had witnessed the chase came running into the alley, followed closely by a police officer who happened to be patrolling nearby. Seeing he was outnumbered, Rajesh's shoulders slumped in defeat. He slowly held out my purse, which the officer quickly took from him. The next hour was a blur of questions and paperwork. The officer handcuffed Rajesh and put it in the back of a patrol car while I gave my statement. I had to describe everything that had happened, from our initial Tinder conversations to the moment Rajesh grabbed my purse. As the adrenaline wore off, I started to feel shaky and overwhelmed. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I couldn't believe my Tinder date had turned into a police incident. The officer assured me that Rajesh would be charged with theft and that I'd need to come to the station later to file a formal report. After retrieving my purse and making sure everything was still inside, I decided to walk home instead of taking a cab. I needed the time to clear my head and process the evening's events. As I walked, I couldn't help but replay every moment of the date in my mind, searching for red flags I might have missed. When I finally got home, I collapsed on my couch, emotionally and physically drained. I called my best friend to tell her what had happened, and she rushed over with ice cream and a sympathetic ear. We stayed up late into the night, dissecting every detail of the disastrous date. The next few days were a whirlwind of follow-up tasks. I had to go to the police station to give a more detailed statement and identify Rajesh in a lineup. I also had to cancel all my credit cards and change the locks on my apartment, just in case Rajesh had managed to see my address on any of the documents in my purse. A week later, I received a call from the detective assigned to my case. They informed me that Rajesh had a history of similar crimes and was actually wanted in connection with several other theft incidents in the area. Apparently, he had been using dating apps to target unsuspecting victims for months. Hearing this information made me feel both vindicated and foolish. On one hand, I was glad to know that Rajesh's actions weren't my fault or something I could have prevented. On the other hand, I felt foolish for not being more cautious about meeting a stranger from the internet. As the weeks passed, I slowly started to feel more like myself again. The initial shock and fear faded, replaced by a newfound appreciation for my own resilience. I even found myself able to laugh about some aspects of the situation, like the absurdity of chasing a thief down the street in the middle of a first date. Eventually, I received notice that Rajesh had pleaded guilty to multiple charges of theft and fraud. He was sentenced to several years in prison, bringing a sense of closure to the whole ordeal. While I was relieved that justice had been served, part of me couldn't help but wonder about the circumstances that had led Rajesh to this point in his life. I'm still amazed at how quickly a seemingly normal date turned into something so unexpected and frightening. It's a story I'll probably be telling for years to come. My infamous Tinder date turned purse-snatching chase through the city streets. Tinder dates wouldn't usually end with sirens and handcuffs, but that's exactly what happened, my Met saying. It all started innocently enough. A casual swipe right, some witty banter, and plans for a movie night. Little did I know I was about to star in my own real-life thriller. The day our date arrived, and I found myself more excited than usual. Zane had been charming in our chats, with a great sense of humor and interesting stories. I spent extra time getting ready, hoping this might be the start of something special. As I walked up to the cinema, I spotted Zane waiting outside. He was even more handsome in person, tall, with warm brown eyes and a killer smile. We greeted each other with a slightly awkward hug, then headed inside to get our tickets and snacks. The pre-movie small talk flowed easily. Zane asked about my job, my hobbies, and my favorite films. He seemed genuinely interested, laughing at my jokes and sharing his own stories. By the time we settled into our seats, I was feeling pretty good about how the evening was going. The lights dimmed and the movie started. It was some action flick, not usually my thing, but Zane had picked it and I was happy to go along. About 20 minutes in, I felt Zane's hand brush against mine. I smiled to myself, enjoying the butterflies of a new connection. That's when things took a turn I never saw coming. I noticed some movement at the back of the theater, a few people entering quietly. In the dim light, I could just make out what looked like police uniforms. My heart started racing. Were they chasing someone? Was there a threat? Before I could fully process what was happening, several officers were suddenly in our row. They grabbed Zane, yanking him out of his seat. I sat there frozen, unable to believe what I was seeing. Zane looked just as shocked, his eyes wide with panic. The officers quickly cuffed him and started leading him away. One of them turned to me and asked if I was all right. I nodded dumbly, still trying to wrap my head around the situation. As they escorted Zane out, the officer explained that he was a wanted fugitive with outstanding warrants in multiple states. I sat there in stunned silence as the movie continued to play. My mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the charming guy I had been on a date with and the criminal the police had just arrested. How could I have been so wrong about him? The rest of the film passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything happening on screen. My thoughts a jumbled mess of confusion and fear. When the credits finally rolled, I stumbled out of the theater in a daze. Outside, a small crowd had gathered to watch as Zane was loaded into a police car. Our eyes met for a brief moment as they'd put him in the backseat. The look on his face was a mix of shame and resignation. Then they drove away, leaving me standing there feeling completely shell-shocked. I called an Uber, my hands shaking as I'd opened the app. During the ride home, I couldn't resist Googling Zane's name. Several news articles popped up, detailing his alleged crimes. There were reports of elaborate fraud schemes and even violent assaults. It was surreal seeing his face, the same face that had smiled at me over popcorn just hours earlier, plastered across these shocking headlines. As I read more about Zane's criminal history, I started to feel physically ill. How close had I come to becoming another one of his victims? What if we had gone somewhere more private for our date? What if I'd invited him back to my place? The possibilities made my skin crawl. When I got home, I collapsed on my couch, still trying to process the night's events. I replayed our conversations in my head, searching for any red flags I might have missed. But there had been nothing obvious. Zane had seemed so normal, so genuine. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. The events of the previous night came flooding back, and I had to resist the urge to call in sick to work. As I went through my day, I felt like I was in a fog. Coworkers asked if I was feeling okay, noticing my distracted state. I mumbled excuses about not sleeping well, not ready to share the real story. That evening, I got a call from a detective working on Zane's case. He asked me to come in and give a statement about our interactions. Sitting in the police station recounting the details of our Tinder chats and brief date made the whole thing feel even more surreal. The detective filled me in on more details of Zane's alleged crimes. Apparently, he had been using dating apps to find potential victims for his scams. He would charm them, gain their trust, and then exploit them financially or worse. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized how easily I could have fallen into his trap. Over the next few weeks, I found myself jumping at every unexpected noise and viewing everyone I met with suspicion. I deleted Tinder and all my other dating apps, too scared to even think about meeting someone new. Friends tried to cheer me up, telling me it was just a freak occurrence, but I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. How could I trust my own judgment after being so completely fooled? As time passed, the initial shock began to wear off. I started to look at the experience with a bit more perspective. While it had definitely been traumatic, I realized how lucky I was that things hadn't gone further with Zane. Slowly, I began to regain my confidence. I started going out more, reconnecting with friends I had neglected while focused on dating. I threw myself into new hobbies and interests, finding joy in activities that didn't involve the risk of meeting criminals. A few months after the incident, I received another call from the detective. Zane had been convicted on multiple charges and would be serving a lengthy prison sentence. While part of me felt relieved, another part still struggled to reconcile the person I had met with the criminal he turned out to be. Today, almost a year later, the memory of that night at the movies still feels a bit unreal. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what might have happened if the police hadn't shown up when they did. But mostly, I'm just grateful for the wake-up call it provided. I'm dating again now, albeit much more cautiously. I always meet in public places and do some light background checking before getting too invested. And while I haven't sworn off dating apps completely, I approach them with a healthy dose of skepticism. It was just another mundane Tuesday night when I decided to kill some time on Tinder. Little did I know this casual swipe session would lead me down a rabbit hole of deception and disappointment. As I lazily flicked through profiles, one particular face caught my eye, Davina. Her smile was radiant, her eyes deep and alluring. I found myself pausing, taking in every detail of her photos. Davina's profile was a breath of fresh air. Her bio was witty and intriguing, mentioning a love for obscure indie bands and a passion for spicy food that rivaled my own. Without hesitation, I swiped right, silently hoping for a match. To my surprise, we connected instantly. Even more shocking, Davina messaged first. She complimented my taste in music, referencing a band I wore in one of my photos. It was a relatively unknown group, and I was impressed she recognized it. This kickstarted a conversation that flowed effortlessly. We chatted about everything under the sun. Davina told me she was a graphic designer for a startup, and her enthusiasm for her work was contagious. She described a project she was working on, her artistic process, and her dreams of freelancing full-time one day. I found myself hanging on her every word, completely engrossed in her passion. Our conversation meandered through various topics. We discovered a shared love for travel, swapping stories about our favorite destinations and places we longed to visit. Davina's description of a backpacking trip through South America was so vivid, I felt like I was right there with her, trekking through the Andes. As the night wore on, we delved into deeper subjects. We discussed our families, our hopes for the future, and our fears. Davina opened up about her struggles with anxiety, and I shared my own experiences with imposter syndrome. It felt incredibly natural, like talking to an old friend rather than a stranger from a dating app. Before I knew it, the clock read 3 a.m. I couldn't believe how quickly time had flown. Reluctantly, we agreed it was time to call it a night. We exchanged numbers, promising to continue our chat the next day. As I drifted off to sleep, my mind was filled with thoughts of Davina and the connection we forged. The following day, I woke up to a good morning text from Davina. We picked up right where we left off, messaging throughout the day. She sent me memes that had me laughing out loud at my desk, and we made tentative plans to meet up over the weekend for coffee. That evening, I met my best friend Jake for our weekly pub quiz night. I couldn't stop talking about Davina, gushing about how amazing she was and how much we had in common. Jake listened patiently, a bemused smile on his face. "Let me see a picture of this dream girl," he said, reaching for my phone. I pulled up Davina's profile, proudly showing Jake her photos. As he scrolled through them, his brow furrowed. He squinted at the screen, tilting his head slightly. "Dude, she looks really familiar," Jake muttered. "I swear I've seen her somewhere before." I brushed off his comment, assuming Davina just had one of those faces. But Jake couldn't let go. He pulled out his own phone and started searching, his thumbs flying over the keyboard. After a few minutes of intense scrolling, Jake's eyes widened. He looked up at me, his expression a mix of pity and discomfort. "Man, I hate to tell you this, but I think you're being catfished," he said, turning his phone to show me what he found. My stomach dropped as I stared at the screen. The clear as day was Davina's face, except it wasn't Davina at all. It was a famous Argentine singer named Lali Esposito. The photos on the Tinder profile were taken directly from her Instagram account. I felt like I'd been doused in ice water. The connection I thought we had, the hours of intimate conversation, it all came crashing down around me. How could I have been so stupid? In a daze, I scrolled through Lolly's Instagram, finding photo after photo that Davina had used. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd been completely fooled. My mind raced, replaying every interaction we'd had. Was any of it real? The job, the travels, the personal struggles, were they all fabricated? I felt violated, knowing I'd shared personal details in my life with a complete stranger hiding behind a fake identity. Anger bubbled up inside me, followed quickly by embarrassment. I'd always thought I was too smart to fall for something like this. Yet here I was completely taken in by a carefully crafted lie. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the block button on Davina's profile. Part of me wanted to confront her, or whoever was behind the profile, to demand answers. But I knew it would be pointless. Instead, I blocked her on Tinder and deleted her number from my phone. The next few days were a blur. I oscillated between anger, shame, and a strange sense of loss. Even though Davina wasn't real, the connection I felt was. It was hard to reconcile the person I thought I knew with the reality of the situation. I couldn't help but analyze every interaction, looking for clues I might have missed. There were red flags now that I thought about it. Davina always had an excuse for why she couldn't video chat. Her photos were all extremely high quality, almost too perfect. Some of the details she shared about her life were vague or inconsistent. But in the moment, caught up in the excitement of a new connection, I'd overlooked these warning signs. I wanted to believe I found someone special, so I ignored the little doubts nagging at the back of my mind. As the initial shock wore off, curiosity set in. I found myself wondering about the person behind the fake profile. What was their motivation? Were they just lonely and looking for a connection, or did they have more sinister intentions? The not knowing was almost as unsettling as the deception itself. I took a break from Tinder after that, needing time to process what had happened. The experience left me feeling jaded about online dating. When I eventually returned to the app, I approached every match with caution, always on the lookout for signs of deception. Weeks passed, and the sting of the experience began to fade. I still thought about Davina sometimes, or rather, the person I thought she was. It was a harsh lesson in the realities of online dating, a reminder that not everyone is who they claim to be on the internet. So I matched with Steve. His profile caught my eye, great smile, witty bio, and we seemed to have a lot in common. After chatting for a few days, he suggested meeting up for dinner. I had been on plenty of Tinder dates before, so I thought nothing of it and agreed. We decided on a cozy Italian place downtown. I arrived a few minutes early and waited at the bar, sipping a glass of wine to calm my nerves. When Steve walked in, I was relieved to see he looked just like his photos. Tall, dark-haired, with a friendly grin. He gave me a quick hug, and we headed to our table. The restaurant had a warm, intimate atmosphere with soft lighting and candles on each table. As we settled in, Steve seemed charming and attentive. He asked me questions about my job, my hobbies, and my family. I started to relax, thinking this might turn out to be a good date after all. We ordered our food at the Pasta Primavera while Steve chose the chicken parmesan. As we waited for our meals, the conversation flowed easily. We discovered we both loved hiking and had even been to some of the same trails. Steve told funny stories about his job as a software engineer, and I shared some anecdotes about my work in marketing. But as the evening progressed, I began to notice some odd behavior. Steve kept glancing around the restaurant nervously, as if he was worried about being seen. When I asked if everything was okay, he brushed it off, saying he thought he saw someone he knew. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it was the first red flag. As we ate our main course, Steve's demeanor changed slightly. He started asking more personal questions. Where exactly I lived, if I had roommates, what my typical schedule was like. I gave vague answers, not wanting to share too much information with someone I've just met. Steve also began making comments about my appearance, complimenting me in a way that felt a bit too intense for a first date. When the topic turned to past relationships, Steve's tone became bitter. He ranted about his crazy ex-girlfriends and how they had all wronged him. The way he spoke about women made me uncomfortable, but I tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics. As we finished our meals, Steve insisted on ordering dessert to share. I wasn't really in the mood for sweets, but I agreed to split a tiramisu. While we ate, Steve moved his chair closer to mine, his knee brushing against my leg under the table. I subtly tried to create some distance, but he kept finding ways to initiate physical contact. When the check came, I reached for my wallet, but Steve waved me off, insisting on paying for everything. As we walked out of the restaurant, he put his arm around my waist. It felt too familiar, too soon, and I gently moved away, pretending to adjust my jacket. Outside, Steve offered to drive me home. I hesitated, remembering my rule about not letting first dates know where I lived. But it was getting late, and I didn't want to wait for a ride share. Against my better judgment, I accepted his offer. The drive to my apartment was tense. Steve kept trying to hold my hand or touch my leg, and I had to repeatedly move away, making excuses about being ticklish or needing to check my phone. He also continued asking probing questions about my living situation, which made me increasingly uneasy. As we pulled up to my building, I felt a wave of relief. I thanked Steve for dinner and quickly got out of the car, hoping to make a swift exit. To my surprise, he got out too, insisting on walking me to my door. My heart started racing as we approached the entrance. I fumbled with my keys, planning to say a quick goodnight and duck inside. But as soon as I cracked the door open, Steve suddenly pushed forward, trying to force his way in. Panic shot through me, and I instinctively shoved the door closed with all my strength. I heard a thud and a grunt as it slammed in his face. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Steve started pounding on the door, yelling for me to let him in. His voice, which had been charming earlier, now sounded angry and threatening. I quickly locked the deadbolt and chain, my hands shaking. Through the door, I could hear Steve's threats escalating. He said he knew where I lived now and that he'd come back. I ran to grab my phone, ready to call the cops. But then I heard the sound of running footsteps. Cautiously, I peeked out the window and saw Steve sprinting to his car. He peeled out of the parking lot, tired of screeching. I spent the rest of the night on a high alert, jumping at every little sound. I triple-checked all my locks and even pushed my heavy dresser in front of the door for extra security. Sleep was impossible. I kept replaying the evening in my mind, wondering how things had gone so wrong and kicking myself for ignoring the warning signs. The next morning, I was exhausted and still shaken. I called my best friend and told her everything that had happened. She came over right away, bringing coffee and staying with me for moral support. With her encouragement, I reported the incident to both Tinder and the police. The Tinder support team was responsive, immediately banning Steve's account. The police took my statement but warned me that without more evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to stay vigilant and contact them immediately if Steve showed up again or tried to contact me. For weeks afterward, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid I'd run into Steve again. I varied my routines, asked a friend to stay with me for a few days, and even considered moving. Gradually, as time passed without incident, I started to relax a little. So, here's my story. It started like any other match, a few witty messages, some shared interests, and plans to meet up. Little did I know I was about to experience the most terrifying night of my life. His name was Alex. Tall, dark-haired, with a charming smile and an impressive job in finance. We hit it off immediately in our chats, bonding over our love for indie films and obscure 80s bands. After a week of messaging, we decided to meet for dinner at a trendy new restaurant downtown. I arrived first, choosing a table near the back for some privacy. When Alex walked in, I felt a flutter of excitement. He looked even better than his photos, dressed sharp in a fitted blazer and dark jeans. His smile lit up his face as he spotted me and made his way over. The first hour flew by as we chatted easily over appetizers and wine. Alex was funny and attentive, asking thoughtful questions about my work and family. I found myself relaxing, thinking this might actually turn into something good. As our main courses arrived, I excused myself to use the restroom. On my way back, I noticed Alex hunched over our table, fiddling with something. When he saw me approaching, he quickly sat up straight, flashing that winning smile again. I brushed it off, assuming he was just checking his phone. We continued our meal, but I started feeling a bit dizzy and unfocused. I blamed it on the wine and tried to shake it off. Alex suggested we skip dessert and go for a walk instead. The fresh air sounded appealing, so I agreed. As we left the restaurant, my vision blurred slightly. I stumbled, and Alex caught my arm, steadying me. His grip felt too tight, but I was having trouble focusing on anything. We walked for a while, Alex leading the way. I realized hazily that we were heading away from the busy streets into a quieter residential area. My heart started racing as panic set in. Something was very wrong. I tried to speak to tell Alex I needed to go home, but my tongue felt heavy in my mouth. He must have sensed my distress because he stopped and turned to face me. "Don't worry," he said softly, his eyes cold despite his smile. "We're almost there." I wanted to run to scream, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Alex wrapped an arm around my waist, practically carrying me now. We approached an old, run-down house on a dark street. My mind was screaming danger, but I couldn't make my limbs obey. Alex fished out a key and opened the front door, dragging me inside. The house was empty, dusty, with sheets covering what little furniture remained. He led me to a back room where a single chair sat in the center, ropes coiled on the floor beside it. As he forced me into the chair, I managed to croak out a weak "why?" Alex's face twisted into something unrecognizable as he began tying my wrists to the armrests. "You're all the same," he spat. "You think you're so special, so much better than everyone else. But you're not. You're just like all the others." Tears streamed down my face as I realized the gravity of my situation. Alex continued his rant, pacing around the room, gesturing wildly. He talked about other girls he met online, how they'd all rejected him eventually. I was going to make them pay, starting with me. I struggled against the ropes, but they were tied tight. Whatever drug Alex had slipped me was wearing off, replaced by sheer terror. I watched helplessly as he pulled out a duffel bag from behind a sheet-covered couch, unzipping it to reveal an assortment of knives and other sharp objects. Just as Alex turned back towards me, a loud crash came from the front of the house. He froze, eyes wide with surprise and anger. Heavy footsteps approached rapidly. Alex cursed, grabbing a knife from his bag and moving to stand behind me, pressing the blade against my throat. The door burst open, and 2 police officers rushed in, guns drawn. "Police!" dropped the weapon when shouted. Alex's hand trembled against my neck as he weighed his options. After a tense moment, I felt the knife leave my skin as he let it clatter to the floor. As one officer cuffed Alex, the other quickly untied me, asking if I was hurt. I shook my head, still in shock. They explained that the restaurant owner had seen Alex spike my drink and called the police. They'd been tracking Alex's phone, which led them here. The next few hours passed in a blur. I was taken to the hospital for a checkup, then to the police station to give a statement. My family arrived, hugging me tightly, tears in their eyes. I learned that Alex was wanted for assault and kidnapping in 2 other states, all with a similar story, meeting girls online and luring them to secluded locations. Days later, I sat in my apartment, still processing everything that had happened. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Alex had been denied bail and was facing multiple felony charges. Relief washed over me, knowing he couldn't hurt anyone else. I deleted Tinder from my phone, along with all my other dating apps. The thought of meeting another stranger filled me with dread. I knew it would take time to feel safe again, to trust my own judgment. But I was alive, and for now that was enough. As I curled up on my couch, my cat purring beside me, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had survived something terrible, and I was stronger for it. Whatever came next, I knew I could face it. For the first time since that night, I felt like I could breathe again. I never expected a Tinder date to turn into a real-life horror story, but that's exactly what happened to me last month. It all started with a simple swipe right on a guy named Thomas. Little did I know that single action would lead to the most terrifying night of my life. Thomas' profile caught my eye immediately. His pictures showed a tall, blonde man with piercing blue eyes and a charming smile. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine cover. His bio was equally impressive, a 28-year-old civil engineer working on major infrastructure projects in London. I couldn't believe my luck when we matched. Our conversation kicked off instantly. Thomas was witty, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We texted constantly over the next week, chatting about everything from our favorite books to our dream vacations. He told me about his latest project, a new bridge in central London, and I shared stories about my job in marketing. It felt like we'd known each other for years. After a week of nonstop texting, Thomas suggested meeting up for dinner. He recommended Nando's, saying it was casual enough for a first date, but still had great food. I agreed, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. We set the date for Friday night at 7 p.m. On the day of our date, I spent hours getting ready. I picked out my favorite black jeans and a nice blouse, wanting to look good but not too dressed up for Nando's. I even splurged on a new lipstick for the occasion. As I got ready, I couldn't help but daydream about how the evening might go. Would we hit it off in person as well as we had over text? I arrived at Nando's 5 minutes early, my stomach fluttering with butterflies. The restaurant was busy with the usual Friday night crowd. I chose a table near the window, thinking it would be easy for Thomas to spot me when he arrived. As I waited, I kept glancing at the door, expecting to see the handsome man from the photos walk in at any moment. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. I started to feel a bit anxious. Had he forgotten? Just as I was about to send him a message, I noticed someone approaching my table. My heart sank as I realized this person looked nothing like the Thomas I'd been expecting. The man standing before me was easily in his late 40s, at least 20 years older than the person in the profile pictures. He was short and stocky, with thinning gray hair and a scraggly beard. His clothes were stained and wrinkled, looking like they hadn't been washed in weeks. But the most shocking thing was the overwhelming smell of alcohol that seemed to radiate from him. My hand started shaking as he sat down across from me without asking. In a slurred voice, he introduced himself as Thomas. My mind was reeling. How could this be the same person I had been talking to all week? As he spoke, I noticed his hands trembling and he couldn't seem to maintain eye contact. Thomas admitted that everything in his profile had been a lie. There was no engineering job, no London flat, nothing. He was actually unemployed and homeless, living in a shelter on the outskirts of the city. The photos he'd used were stolen from someone else's social media accounts. As he continued talking, things got even more disturbing. Thomas mentioned he'd been watching my profile for weeks before matching with me. He knew where I worked based on my Instagram photos, which had foolishly linked to my Tinder profile. He even described seeing me at the local coffee shop near my office several times before we matched. The realization that he'd been stalking me made my blood run cold. I tried to stay calm while figuring out how to leave safely. When Thomas got up to order food, stumbling drunkenly to the counter, I saw my chance. I grabbed my bag and rushed toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I reached for the handle, I heard him calling my name. Panic set in as I pushed through the door and into the parking lot. It was surprisingly empty for a Friday night, with only a few cars scattered around. I could hear Thomas' uneven footsteps behind me as I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys. Just as I got my car door open, I heard Thomas' voice right behind me. He was asking where I was going, saying we hadn't even ordered yet. I jumped into the driver's seat and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I started the engine, I looked in my rearview mirror. Thomas was standing just a few feet away, swaying slightly and staring at me with an unsettling look in his eyes. I put the car in reverse and sped out of the parking lot, my heart racing. For the next few weeks, I was constantly on edge. I kept seeing Thomas's face everywhere I went, jumping at every sudden movement or sound. I varied my routine, taking different routes to work and avoiding my usual coffee shop. I was terrified he might show up at my workplace or home. A few days after the incident, I decided to do some research. I reverse image searched the photos from Thomas' profile and found they belonged to a real engineer in Manchester. I reported his fake profile to Tinder, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he might have done this to other women too. That night at Nando's changed me. You never really know who's on the other side of the screen. I never thought I'd be the victim of a catfishing prank, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. My Tinder nightmare began on a regular Tuesday evening when I was swiping through profiles, bored and hoping to find a genuine connection. That's when I came across Dare's profile. Her photos were captivating. Long, wavy dark hair, piercing green eyes, and a smile that could melt hearts. Her bio was witty and relatable, mentioning her love for obscure indie bands and passion for street photography. I swiped right without hesitation, and to my surprise, we matched instantly. Our conversation flowed effortlessly from the start. We bonded over our shared taste in music, exchanging recommendations for underground artists. Deer seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of photography, and I found myself Googling the techniques and photographers she mentioned, eager to keep up with her passion. As days passed, our chats became more frequent and personal. We'd send good morning messages and share funny memes throughout the day. Deer told me about her job as a graphic designer and her dreams of opening her own studio someday. I opened up about my own career struggles and aspirations. It felt like I'd known her for years, not just a week. When Deer suggested meeting up for coffee, I was thrilled. We decided on a cozy cafe downtown for Saturday afternoon. I spent the whole week looking forward to our date, even buying a new shirt for the occasion. Saturday arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. I got to the cafe 20 minutes early, chose a table by the window, and ordered a latte to calm my jitters. Every time the door chimed, my heart raced, wondering if it was Dyer. At exactly 2 p.m., our agreed meeting time, the door opened again. I looked up expectantly, but instead of the beautiful woman I'd been chatting with all week, I saw a guy about my age, looking around nervously. Our eyes met, and he walked straight to my table. "Are you waiting for Dyer?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Confused, I nodded. That's when he sat down across from me, and my world turned upside down. "I'm Dyer," he said, avoiding eye contact. "Well, not really. My name's Alex. The profile, it was fake. I'm sorry." I sat there, stunned into silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The guy in front of me looked nothing like the Dyer I'd been talking to. He was shorter, with short brown hair and stubble. He wore a plain t-shirt and jeans, a far cry from the stylish outfits in Deer's photos. Alex started explaining in a rush, words tumbling out. He and his friends had created the fake profile as a prank for their YouTube channel. They used photos of his cousin, who was a model, to make the profile more attractive. Their plan was to film guys' reactions when they showed up instead of the girl in the pictures. As he spoke, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me: shock, anger, embarrassment, and a deep sense of betrayal. All those conversations, the connection I thought we had, it was all a lie. I'd spent a week getting excited about meeting someone who didn't even exist. Alex kept apologizing, saying he felt guilty and decided to come clean instead of standing me up or going through with the prank. But his words felt hollow. All I could think about was how stupid I'd been, how easily I'd fallen for the deception. I sat there, staring at my now cold latte, barely hearing Alex's continued apologies and explanations. The cafe that had seemed so cozy before now felt suffocating. Other patrons were starting to glance our way, probably sensing the tension at our table. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I found my voice. "I need to go," I muttered, standing up abruptly. Alex started to say something else, but I was already walking away, pushing through the door and out onto the street. I walked aimlessly for a while, trying to process what had just happened. The busy sidewalks and traffic noise felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream. How could I have been so careless? I replayed our conversations in my head, looking for signs I might have missed. But there weren't any. The deception had been perfect. When I finally got home, I collapsed on my couch, feeling drained. I pulled out my phone and stared at Deer's, or rather the fake profile's, messages. They seemed different now, tainted by the knowledge of the truth. I deleted the Tinder app in a moment of frustration, then immediately regretted it, realizing I lost all evidence of our conversations. The next few days were a blur. I cycled through various emotions: anger at Alex and his friends for their cruel prank, embarrassment at falling for it, and a deep sense of loss for the connection I thought I'd found. I avoided my phone, dreading the possibility of Alex trying to contact me again. It took me almost a week to tell anyone what happened. I finally confided in my roommate, who was equal parts sympathetic and outraged. He helped me report the fake profile to Tinder, though I doubted it would do much good. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock wore off, but the impact lingered. I found myself second-guessing every online interaction, wondering if people were really who they claimed to be. The thought of using dating apps again made me anxious, but the alternative, meeting people in real life, seemed equally daunting. Slowly, I started to emerge from my shell. I threw myself into work and picked up new hobbies to keep my mind occupied. I joined a local photography club, remembering how passionate Dior had been about it. Ironically, learning about photography became a form of therapy, helping me process the experience. Months passed, and the sting of the catfishing incident faded. I cautiously dipped my toes back into the dating pool, this time with a healthier dose of skepticism. I insisted on video calls before meeting anyone in person and chose public places for first dates. Looking back now, I can see how that experience changed me. It made me more cautious, yes, but also more appreciative of genuine connections. The memory of that day in the cafe still makes me cringe, but it no longer has the power to ruin my day. I never heard from Alex again, and I often wonder if he really felt as guilty as he claimed, or if it was just another part of the act. Either way, I hope he realized the potential consequences of his prank and stopped doing it to others. As for me, I'm still navigating the complicated world of online dating, but with clearer eyes and stronger boundaries. The catfishing incident was a harsh lesson, but one that ultimately made me wiser and more resilient. And who knows, maybe someday I'll meet someone real who appreciates a good cautionary tale over coffee. Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.